Okay. So we are reading Journey to the Center of the Earth, Chapter 21, Under the Ocean. By the next day, we had nearly forgotten our past sufferings. The first sensation I experienced was a surprise at not being thirsty, and I actually asked myself the reason. The running stream, which flowed in rippling wavelets at my feet, was the satisfactory reply. We breakfasted with a good appetite, and then drank our fill of the excellent water. I felt myself quite a new man, ready to go anywhere my uncle chose to lead. I began to think, why should not a man as seriously convicted as my uncle succeed with so excellent a guide as worthy Hans, and so devoted a nephew as myself? These were brilliant ideas which now invaded my brain. Had the proposition now been made to go back to the summit of Mount Sneffels, I should have declined the offer in a most indignant manner. But fortunately, there was no question of going up. We were about to descend farther into the interior of the earth. Let us keep moving, I cried, awakening the echoes of the old world. We resumed our march on Thursday at 8 o'clock in the morning. The great granite tunnel, as it went round by sinuous and winding ways, presented every now and then in sharp turns, and in fact, all the appearance of a labyrinth. Its direction, however, was in general towards the southwest. My uncle made several pauses in order to consult his compass. The gallery now began to trend downward in a horizontal direction, with about 2 inches of fall in every furlong. The murmuring stream flowed quietly at our feet. I could not but compare it to some familiar spirit, guiding us through the earth, and I dabbled my fingers in its tepid water, which sang like a naiad as we progressed. My good humor began to assume a mythological character. As for my uncle, he began to complain of the horizontal character of the road. His route, he found, began to be indefinitely prolonged, instead of sliding down the celestial ray, according to his expression. But we had no choice, and as long as our road led toward the center, however, little progress was made. There was no reason to complain. Moreover, from time to time the slopes were much greater, the naiads sang more loudly, and we began to dip downward in earnest. As yet now I felt no painful sensation. I had not got over the excitement of discovery of water. That day and the next we did a considerable amount of horizontal and relatively little vertical traveling. On Friday evening, the 10th of July, according to our estimation, we ought to have been 30 leagues to the southeast of Reykjavik, and about 2 leagues and a half deep. We now received a rather startling surprise. Under our feet there opened a horrible well. My uncle was so delighted that he actually clapped his hands as he saw how steep and sharp the descent. Aha! He cried in rapturous delight. This will take us a long way. Look at the projections of the rock. Ha! He exclaimed. It's a fearful staircase. Hans, however, who in all our troubles had never given up the ropes, took care so to dispose of them as to prevent any accidents. Our descent then began. I dare not call it a perilous descent, for I was already too familiar with that sort of work to look upon it as anything but a very ordinary affair. This well was a kind of narrow opening in the massive granite of the kind known as a fissure. The contraction of the terrestrial scaffolding, when it suddenly cooled, had been evidently the cause. If it had ever served in former times as a kind of funnel through which passed the eruptive masses vomited by Sneffels, I was at a loss to explain how it had left no mark. We were, in fact, descending in a spiral, something like those winding staircases used in modern houses. We were compelled every quarter of an hour or thereabouts to sit down in order to rest our legs. Our calves ached. We then seated ourselves on some projecting rock, with our legs hanging over, and gossiped while we ate a mouthful of drinking, still from the pleasantly warm running stream which had not deserted us. It is scarcely necessary to say that in this curiously shaped fissure the Hansbach had become a cascade to the detriment of its size. It was still, however, sufficient, and more for our wants. Besides, we knew that as soon as the declivity ceased to be so abrupt, the stream must resume its peaceful course. At this moment, it reminded me of my uncle, his impatience and rage. While and it flowed more peacefully, I pictured to myself the placidity of the Icelandic guide. During the whole of 2 days, the 6th and 7th of July, we followed the extraordinary spiral staircase of the fissure, penetrating 2 leagues farther into the crust of the earth, which put us 5 leagues below the level of the sea. On the 8th, however, at 12 o'clock in the day, the fissure suddenly assumed a more gentle slope, still trending in a southeast direction. The road now became comparatively easy, and at the same time dreadfully monotonous. It would have been difficult for matters to have turned out otherwise. Our peculiar journey had no chance of being diversified by landscape and scenery. At all events, such was my idea. At length, on Wednesday the 15th, we were actually 7 leagues, 21 miles below the surface of the earth, and 50 leagues distant from the mountains of Sneffels. Though, if the truth be told, we were very tired, our health had resisted all suffering, and was in a most satisfactory state. Our traveler's box of medicaments had not even been opened. My uncle was careful not to note every hour the indications of the compass, of the manometer, and of the thermometer, all which he afterwards published in his elaborate philosophical and scientific account of our remarkable voyage. He was therefore able to give an exact relation of the situation. When, therefore, he informed me that we were 50 leagues in a horizontal direction distant from our starting point, I could not suppress a loud exclamation. "What's the matter now?" cried my uncle. Nothing very important, only an idea has entered my head," was my reply. "Well, out with it, my boy." "It is my opinion that if your calculations are correct, we are no longer under Iceland." "Do you think so?" "We can very easily find out," I replied, pulling out a map and compasses. "You see," I said, after careful measurement, "that I am not mistaken. We are far beyond Cape Portland, and those 50 leagues to the southeast will take us into the open sea." "Under the open sea?" cried my uncle, rubbing his hands with a delighted air. "Yes," I cried, "no doubt old ocean flows over our heads." "Well, my dear boy, what can be more natural? Do you know that in the neighborhood of Newcastle there are coal mines which have been worked far out under the sea?" Now, my worthy uncle, the professor, no doubt regarded this discovery as a very simple fact, but to me the idea was by no means a pleasant one, and yet when one came to think the matter over seriously, what mattered it whether the plains and the mountains of Iceland were suspended over our devoted heads, or the mighty billows of the Atlantic Ocean? The whole question rested on the solidity of the granite roof above us. However, I soon got used to the ideal for the passage, now level, running down, and still always to the southeast, kept going deeper and deeper into the profound abysses of Mother Earth. 3 days later, on the 18th day of July, on a Saturday, we reached a kind of vast grotto. My uncle here paid Hans his usual Rix dollars? Sure, yeah. It was decided that the next day should be a day of rest. Chapter 22. Sunday Below Ground. I awoke on Sunday morning without any sense of hurry and bustle attendant on an immediate departure, though the day to be devoted to repose and reflection was spent under such strange circumstances and in so wonderful a place The idea was a pleasant one. Besides, we all began to get used to this kind of existence. I had almost ceased to think of the sun, of the moon, of the stars, of the trees, houses, and towns. In fact, about any terrestrial necessities in our particular position, we were far above such reflections. The grotto was vast and magnificent hall. Along its granitic soil the stream flowed placidly and pleasantly. So great a distance was it now from its fiery source that its water was scarcely lukewarm, and could be drunk without delay or difficulty. After frugal breakfast, the professor made up his mind to devote some hours to putting his notes and calculations in order. In the first place, he said, I have a good many to verify and prove, in order that we may know our exact position. I wish to be able to return to the upper regions to make a map of our journey, a kind of vertical section of the globe, which will be, as it were, the profile of the expedition. That would indeed be a curious work, uncle. But can you make your observations without anything like certainty and precision? I can. I have never, on any occasion, failed to note with great care the angles and slopes. I am certain as to having made no mistake. Take the compass and examine how she points. I looked at the instrument with care. East 1/4 southeast. Very good, resumed the professor, noting the observation, and going through some rapid calculations. I make out that we have journeyed 250 miles from the point of our departure. Then the mighty waves of the Atlantic are rolling over our heads. Certainly. And at this sorry, I forget who I'm reading. At this very moment, it is possible that fierce tempests are raging above, and that men and ships are battling against the angry blast just over our heads. It is quite within the range of possibility, rejoined my uncle. And that whales are playing in shoals, thrashing the bottom of the sea, the roofs of our adamantine prison. Be quiet, at rest on the be quite at rest on that point. There is no danger of their breaking through. But to return to our calculations. We are to the southeast, 250 miles from the base of Sneffels, and, according to my preceding notes, I think we have gone 16 leagues in a downward direction. 16 leagues, 50 miles, I cried. 50 miles, I cried. I am sure of it. But that is the extreme limit allowed for science for the thickness of the earth's crust, I replied, referring to my geological studies. I do not contravene that assertion, was his quite clear answer. And at this stage of our journey, according to all known laws on the increase of heat, there should be a temperature from 1500 degrees Reaumur. There should be, you say, my boy. In which case this granite would not exist, but be in a state of fusion. But you perceive, my boy, that it is not so, and that facts, as usual, are very stubborn things, overruling all theories. I am forced to yield to the evidence of my senses, but I am nevertheless very much surprised. What heat does the thermometer really indicate? Continued the professor. 27/6. So that science is wrong by 1474 degrees and 4/10, according to which it is demonstrated that the proportional increase in temperature is an exploded error. Humphrey Davy here shines forth in all his glory. He is right, and I have acted wisely to believe him. Have you any answer to make to this statement? Had I chosen to have spoken, I might have said a great deal. I in no way admitted the theory of Humphrey Davy. I still held out for the theory of proportional increase of heat, though I did not feel it. I was far more willing to allow that the chimney of an extinct volcano was covered by lava of a kind refractory to heat. In fact, a bad conductor, which did not allow the great increase of temperature to percolate through its sides. The hot water jet supported my view of the matter. But without entering on a long and useless discussion, or seeking for new arguments to controvert my uncle, I contented myself with taking up facts as they were. Well, sir, I take for granted all your calculations are correct, but allow me to draw from them a rigid and rigorous and definite conclusion. Go on, my boy. Have your say, cried my uncle, good humoredly. At the place where we now are, under the latitude of Iceland, the terrestrial depth is about 1,583 leagues. 1,583 and a quarter. Well, suppose we say 1,600 in round numbers. Now, out of a voyage of 1,600 leagues, we have completed 16. As you say, what then? At the expense of a diagonal journey of no less than 85 leagues. Exactly. We have been 20 days about it. Exactly 20 days. Now, 16 is the 100th part of our contemplated expedition. If we go on in this way, we shall be 2,000 days. That is about 5 years and a half going down. The professor folded his arms, listened, but did not speak. Without counting that if a vertical descent of 16 leagues costs us a horizontal of 85, we shall have to go about 8,000 leagues to the southeast, and we must therefore come out somewhere in the circumference long before we can hope to reach the center. Bother your calculations, cried my uncle in one of his old rages. On what basis do they rest? How do you know that this passage does not take us direct to the end we require? Moreover, I have in my favor, fortunately, a precedent. What I have undertaken to do, another has done, and we have succeeded. Why should I not be equally successful? I hope, indeed, you will, but still, I suppose I may be allowed to. You are allowed to hold your tongue, cried the Professor Hardwigg, when you talk so unreasonably as this. I saw at once that the old doctorial professor was still alive in my uncle, and fearful to rouse his angry passions, I dropped the unpleasant subject. Now then, he explained, consult the manometer. What does that indicate? A considerable amount of pressure. Very good. You see, then, that by descending slowly, and by gradually accustoming ourselves to the density of this lower atmosphere, we shall not suffer. Well, I suppose not, except it may be a certain amount of pain in the ears, was my rather grim reply. That, my dear boy, is nothing, and you will easily get rid of that source of discomfort by bringing the exterior air in communication with the air contained in your lungs. Perfectly, I said, for I had quite made up my mind in no wise to contradict my uncle. I should fancy almost that I should experience a certain amount of satisfaction in making a plunge into the dense atmosphere. Have you taken note of how wonderfully sound is propagated? Of course I have. There can be no doubt that a journey into the interior of the earth would be an excellent cure for deafness. But then, uncle, I ventured mildly to observe, this density will continue to increase. Yes, according to a law which, however, is scarcely defined, it is true that the intensity of weight will diminish just in proportion to the depth to which we go. You know very well that it is on the surface of the earth that its action is most powerfully felt, while on the contrary, in the very center of the earth, bodies cease to have any weight at all. I know that is the case, but as we progress, will not the atmosphere finally assume the density of water? I know it. When placed under the pressure of 710 atmospheres, cried my uncle with imperturbable gravity. And when we are still lower down? I asked with natural anxiety. Well, lower down, the density will increase even greater. Then how shall we be able to make our way through this atmospheric fog? Well, lower down, the densities will become even greater. Then how shall we be able to make our way through this atmospheric fog? Well, my worthy nephew, we must ballast ourselves by filling our pockets with stones, said Professor Hardwigg. Faith, uncle, you have an answer for everything, was my only reply. I began to feel that it was unwise of me to go any farther into the wide field of hypothesis, for I should certainly have received some difficulty, or rather impossibility, that would have enraged the professor. It was evident, nevertheless, that the air under a pressure which might be multiplied by 1,000 of atmospheres would end by becoming perfectly solid, and that then, admitting our bodies resisted the pressure, we should have to stop in spite of all the reasonings in the world. Facts overcome all arguments. But I thought it best not to urge this argument. My uncle would simply have quoted the example of Saknussemm. Supposing the learned Icelander's journey ever really to have taken place, there was one simple answer to be made. In the 16th century, neither the barometer nor the manometer had been invented. How, then, could Saknussemm have been able to discover, when he did research, the center of the earth? This unanswerable and learned objection I, however, kept to myself, and, bracing up my courage, awaited the course of events, little aware of how adventurous yet were to be the incidents of our remarkable journey. The rest of the day of leisure and repose was spent in calculation and conversation. I made it to a point to agree with the professor in everything, but I envied the perfect indifference of Hans, who, without taking any such trouble about the cause and effect, went blindly onwards wherever destiny chose to lead him. There we go.
Well, sorry everybody. I don't know if Kindle crashed or what. I had a hard time finding where he was at. So,
Oh,
yeah. But
well, that's all right.
towards the end, anyway, that was a quick 2 chapters.
It was. Next chapter is Alone, which is ominous.
It's crazy that they're so far down and over underneath the ocean.
It is. Yeah. Well, you know, his another Jules Verne, 20,000 leagues under the sea. They're not even close to that yet. so they've got a ways to go to get to the center.
That's right.